In December of 1973, movie audiences saw this in the opening shot of what has become known as the most scariest movie of all time. Okay, when I was 12 and I saw this movie, they were playing it on Channel 2. And on Channel 5 that night, they were playing a monster movie, one of my most favorite ones, Them, about the giant ants, right? It was a 1950s horror flick. And I was flipping between both channels because I wanted to see both at the same time. We didn't have DVRs back then, okay? So we had to kind of like roll with that, with what we had. I never saw The Exorcist at that point. I was 12. I was too young when it was released in theaters. I had a very interesting and normal fascination with the devil at that time because I didn't understand it outside of what I knew from cartoons at the time. So when I watched what was happening to this young Regan McNeil, and when the scene finally kicked in, when that first scene, when the doctors came into the house, up into the bedroom, and saw her lashing about on the bed, and her eyes rolled back, I changed the channel. I changed it, and I said, I can't watch this. I was literally shaking. I couldn't sleep that night. I never saw anything like that in my life, and it affected me very painfully, very deeply, to the point that for the next few years, I would say prayers. It actually lured me to want to like really look to God because I didn't know anything about that. I grew up Catholic, but I didn't know anything about the whole tenets of that. So my mother would just tell me, I just say the sign of the cross 3 times before going to sleep and you'll be fine. And I did that. So it helped. It was kind of like my teddy bear, so to speak, my comfort right before going to bed at night. Because the idea of having something invisible and unnatural like that take control of you was, in my view at the time, the stuff that nightmares were made of. We need to look at fact versus fiction regarding this film. What is fact and what isn't? One thing I learned later on throughout the years was that, according to the novel by William Peter Blatty, that is The Exorcist, the name of the demon that possessed Regan McNeil was a demon by the name of Pazuzu. It turns out that this demon is actually a real symbol in reality, in real life. This was a god that the ancient Mesopotamians worshipped, an Assyrian god. And when you see in the original sequence of the film, it's an archaeological dig in Iraq. And Father Marin, our hero in this movie, goes and you see that something's weighing heavily upon him throughout the first few moments of this film. At first, we don't know what it is. But then when he sees that shot, when we see that shot of the statue of Pazuzu looking right back at him, we finally realize, okay, he knows something. He knows something is coming, and he knows there's going to be a battle of sorts, a war that's been raging probably since time immemorial. You see, under the umbrella of Christian belief, Pazuzu was merely just another one of the demons that fell with Satan after their rebellion against God from heaven, as depicted in books like Milton's Paradise Lost and in some biblical accounts. One must understand the whole picture in order to really get the sense of what this film, The Exorcist, was about. In the case of Regan McNeil, it was actually based on a real case. It was the case of Maryland in 1949, where a young boy, a 14-year-old boy by the name, pseudo-named Robbie, was for several months afflicted by what they called a demonic presence after he had played with a Ouija board because he was trying to reach his aunt who he loved very much, and he apparently died suddenly. He was devastated by that, and she was a spiritist, and she showed him how to use the Ouija board before her death. He tried to reach out to her in it. Things started happening. Within months, he pretty much wasn't Robbie anymore. He was acting like some crazy guy. The family was Lutheran at the time, so after several attempts by the Lutheran ministers, they had to like call upon the Catholic Church to come to the rescue because they didn't know what else to do. And after a couple of months, the exorcism lasted for several weeks, really, until its final end around near Easter. And this is a story that made headlines in local newspapers at the time. Now, this is 1949. This was a few years after the Second World War. So people were still kind of like, the baby boomers were already at their like enjoyment phase of living a good, strong American life. And, in spite of still all the issues that were not okay in America, even at that time. Several years later, in Georgetown University, a young student there by the name of William Peter Blatty actually picked up on this story and even spoke to one of the priests that was involved in the ritual, in which the ritual is the Rite of Exorcism, an actual ritual book that the Catholic Church has been following since its writing back in the 1500s. And William Peter Blatty just dived into it, and he was so fascinated by this story that he wrote the novel that would later give rise to the book. William Friedkin, as the director, enjoyed what he saw and in the book, and he wanted to create a film based on it. And him and William Peter Blatty got together, they collaborated, they argued, they laughed, they shared their stories. They became good friends in the production of this film. And they brought in a young unknown actress at the time, Linda Blair, to play a 12-year-old girl. Some things were changed. Instead of a boy, it was a girl. And some of the things that were depicted in the book were definitely brought into the movie, but because it's a movie, because it was a horror movie, even though William Friedkin claims that wasn't his original intent for the film, it brought a new light into everything that changed the film industry forever. Funny enough, in 1973, when The Exorcist was released, there was something else that was happening in real life back in Europe, in Germany, where a young girl by the name of Anneliese Mitchell was being also, at that time, starting to get afflicted by what they considered a demonic presence, too. It was a sad story because in 1976, after a long and hard, grueling number of exorcisms, due to malnourishment, malnutrition, and starvation, she passed away. The priest was charged. The family was charged. They were all charged with negligence. So part of the story was that they did not want to just give it off as this was the devil's work. This was just a sick girl. And coincidentally enough, that movie, The Exorcist, really brought that to light in the film. The practice of exorcism is very old. You see it in the Bible. Jesus himself did it in the Gospels. And there are even exorcisms in other religions. Judaism has their exorcists. Islam has their exorcists. It's something that kind of goes across the board. There seems to be a common fear or a common thing that seems to have happened throughout the ages where they considered a person just going bat nuts to be a sign of some kind of spiritual oppression, or if not possession. So how is Hollywood to handle this? How is William Friedkin was able to take all the things he ever knew and heard about in regards to the cases of true demonic possession and bring it about into a film? Well, he used William Peter Blatty's novel as his springboard, as his cheat sheet, so to speak, to create this incredible movie that we all love as horror fans. Strange things happened during the case of making this movie, and that's under urban legend thoughts. Even some of the actresses had claimed that several people even died during the production of this movie. There were accidents. I believe there was even a fire that accidentally, unknowingly happened. Nobody knows who started the fire, how it happened. So there's different things that in urban legend, if you can look it up, it's all over YouTube and stuff that kind of like lend to the idea that maybe there was something diabolical and spiritually connected to the making of this film, as if something didn't want this film to be completed, because maybe there was a message in the movie that was a positive message, and it just wanted to stop that from happening. People think this, and as far as I'm concerned about it, well, the jury's still out on that. I mean, first of all, accidents happen all the time in film. When you're making movies, people have accidents. Sometimes there's a fire. Heck, some people even die sometimes during the making of a film or a TV show even. So it's kind of goes with the territory of filmmaking. When you want to tell a story, unfortunate incidents occur, as they pretty much occur in anything that happens in real life. In the area of horror, all bets are off in the realm of children. We've seen that strange surge in the last 10 to 20 years of how many horror films involve kids. And we're like, wow, and that bothers me sometimes, because as a parent, you want to protect your kids, right? You have children. When you were raising them, you can't even think of anything bad happening to them. The Exorcist was one of the first horror films, in the early 70s that showed how a child can be attacked, afflicted. And she didn't know better, because she was playing with the Ouija board, right? The way young Robbie was. Didn't know how, in the case of the film, that opened a doorway to let Pazuzu in. The thing that affects me the most when I watch this movie now, as a grown-up, as an adult, as a parent, is seeing Miss McNeil, her mother, Reagan's mom. You see her agony and her pain in this film. She goes through a lot. She goes through a lot of suffering, and because she cannot stop what's happening, you see, that's the biggest, one of the largest roles of a parent. We want to stop bad things from happening to our children. We want to protect our kids. We are hardwired as parents to do that. It is in our instinct, okay? And we love our kids, and we don't want things to happen to them. So when something happens to them that is beyond our control, there is a helplessness, there is a pain, there is a, oh my God, what am I going to do about this kind of scenario where it just hurts too much. And with that, I can really relate to Miss McNeil's pain, and we see it happening. We see it depicted in the film. She doesn't know what to do. She goes to the doctors. She goes to this. She goes to that. And finally, she goes to Father Damien Karras, because she's starting to really realize that this was something beyond psychiatry, beyond anything that medicine could explain. What this film did to audiences in 1973 is very different from what it would do to audiences now. In 1973, people wrapped around the block to see this movie, and when they saw what they saw on that screen, many of them ran out. Many of them were shaking, the way I was shaking when I was 12 when I saw it as a kid.
Makes my heart beat too fast.
I don't know, it doesn't bother me that much, but I guess it bothered her more than it bothered me.
This is the second time we've seen it. We still can't hack it. No.
Why was that?
It just scared me to death. Things just like this, really scared me to death. I guess it was when she was talking the devil's voice.
Yeah, the part where she started spitting all the green stuff and,
It's one of the most grossest movies in the world. It is. I ain't never took my coat and hit it over my face like that.
They couldn't handle it. Okay, some people were having heart issues. Some people fainted. The content of this film was something that was never really seen before in movie history, that was to that extreme extent at that point. In the early 70s, we were still, audiences were still enjoying horror movies there were different kinds. There was George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, and there was also Rosemary's Baby, which was a movie about the devil as well. But it was different. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a surge of films that involved a fear of Satan. And when The Exorcist came out, it not only put another step towards that area in horror, but it overstepped a boundary, that it people were not expecting to see or hear, because it wasn't just what we saw, it was what we heard as well. It was something unearthly, something satanic, something demonic, something that we couldn't explain. One thing about this film that people tend to say a lot, I've heard many people say it, the scene, the masturbation scene, when she's jamming the crucifix in her area, and people are like, oh yeah, she was masturbating with the crucifix. But every time I see that scene, whenever I've watched it, I never looked at it like that. I've never looked at her masturbating. Masturbation involves, at least to some degree, some kind of pleasure, right? There was no pleasure there. She was in pain. There was nothing but anger. There was nothing but hate. There was nothing but violence. It was more like a self-rape, if you want to say it like that, not masturbation. So, and that was, again, the Pazuzu's way of trying to really kind of like violate this child. Remember, this was a child. She was 12, okay? And to have the mother try to stop her and see what happens at that moment in that scene, from what she did to herself to what she did to her friend, the director, Burt Dennings.
You know what she did? Your canting daughter?
You see the worst that humanity has to offer, because all what this spirit that's affecting Reagan wants to do is to show the human condition the worst it can be. And that is our human fragility, okay? Think about it. In light of current events, we have seen both sides of the coin. Good and evil is like a war that continues. This film portrays the fragility of a young girl whose parents just got divorced, and a priest whose mother's death makes him question his vocation. The arc of Father Damien Karras is so important to this film, because we see his struggle with his vocation and his faith, and how when he finally interacts with the possessed Reagan McNeil, it in a way kind of helps restore his faith, if you see it happen that way, because he didn't believe in an actual evil devil. He actually believed it was all mind stuff, which is what a lot of people had pretty much accepted at the time. Modern science has pretty much pushed out the medieval aspect of some spirit afflicting you, and now has like said, okay, well, he's just psychotic, or he's just schizophrenic, or there's a mental disorders, there are mental illnesses all over the place. So how can you tell true mental illness from true possession? This film tackles that, and it shows it. So does the book. And if you read other books or other films or it addresses the same exact issue. Father Merrin is the hero of this film, in my opinion. Okay, he said it in that deleted scene.
Why this girl? It makes no sense.
I think that the point is to make us despair. To see ourselves as animal and ugly. To reject the possibility that God could love us.
Are we animal and ugly, or are we beautiful? Are we meant for something much more glorious, much more better as human beings? The Exorcist, both psychologically and visually, challenges us to explore those questions of the human condition. Think about that for a second. We're confronted with real evil and horror all the time. We see it in our newspapers. We watch it in the news. We watch it in our local lives. God forbid we experience it personally. But it's something that this film presents to us. And are we going to take it just as another horror film? Or are we going to take it as something that challenges us to look into something deeper? Several years after I saw it, when I was 12 years old, I rented it, and I said, you know what, I'm going to watch this movie from back to back, because at that point, I was so saturated with other horror movies at that point, watching Halloween, Friday the 13th, and other films like that, The Omen, I loved at that point. I said, I got to see this movie. I got to overcome my fear of watching it, because I swore I wasn't ever going to even see this again. And when I finally played it and watched it, I fell in love with the movie, because I saw what it wanted to do. I immediately got it. Like, I knew this wasn't just about heads spinning and green pea soup and ugly voices and craziness. It was also about the compassion and the want of the human condition to want to eradicate and fix what was being threatened. William Friedkin is quite a director. He really made, this was one of the movies that was actually nominated in the Oscars for that year. That's not something that's common in horror films. And yet, he continued on making a few other movies. But one of the most recent things he actually did was he decided to revisit that concept of demon possession and made a small documentary film based on the work of Father Gabriel Amorth, head exorcist in Rome. And he created this incredible film, a documentary, where he actually filmed a real exorcism. And, you know, in that film, you can see that it's not really like what you saw in the movie The Exorcist, but its seeds and elements definitely are there. And of course, this would be on a case-by-case basis regarding people that actually do practice exorcisms, like Father Gabriel Amorth, who unfortunately left us a couple years ago. He was old, but that was his work. That was his life work. Father Gabriel Amorth was kind of like the Father Merrin of the modern age. He really, showed his compassion and love, and he was even a funny man. So when we see Father Merrin in The Exorcist, we see that same kind of compassion. We see that same kind of goodness that we all look for in people, so we can all have a good life. Even regardless of him dying at the hands of the possessed Reagan McNeil, Father Karras did something even bigger at that point. He sacrificed himself, which is actually, if you think about it, he did. He knew what this thing was going to do to him if he invited it in. And when he did, you saw the scene. He threw himself out the window and fell down all those steps right outside the house. And it was the end of him. And the girl was set free from the bondage of the demon. When you're willing to give up your life for someone else, that's what love really does. Love really encompasses to that extent that if I can quote one of the greatest quotes that it was ever stated, there is no greater love than to give up one's life for your friends. Father Karras and Father Merrin both, in their ways, embodied that in this film and brought about the good of the film in light of the horror. You need to see the evil and the darkness in order to get the light shining ever more brightly, because you will allow it to. It's a wonderful thing, and that's something I've always came away with watching this movie, The Exorcist. One of the greatest horror movies of ever. I can't even talk normal English when I think about it. I'm going to give The Exorcist 5 coffee cups. It is a classic. It is arguably still to this day in 2020 one of the greatest, most scariest, most disturbing horror films of all time. So there it is, people. The battle of the ages continue. Is it the demonic or is it ourselves? Is it human evil? Is it demonic evil? Do they both exist? Or is it really one in place of the other? Which one is it? What do you think? Talk to me. Comment below. Share with me what you've known about this film, The Exorcist. We see it in our world. We see it in our streets. What side will we choose? Thank God the movies are there to help us escape for a little while, just for a little while, so we can figure it out for ourselves and for those we love. Ralph Perez here, Horror and Coffee. Take care and stay safe.